All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Anderson House, and thank you for joining us on this beautiful, dry January night here in Washington. My name is Andrew Allen, and I'm the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence, fulfilling the aim of the Continental Army officers and their French counterparts who founded the Society of the Cincinnati in 1783 to perpetuate the memory and legacy of the American Revolution. In addition to tonight's authors talk, the Institute fulfills that aim by supporting advanced study, developing changing exhibitions and other historical programs and tours, advocating for historic preservation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. For tonight's authors talk, a program that is made possible in part from a generous gift from the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati, we welcome Dr. Abby Chandler, who will be discussing her recent book, Seized with the Temper of the Times, Identity and Rebellion in Pre-Revolutionary America, and that was recently published again by Westholme Publishing. Drawing from her research, Dr. Chandler will show us how the Stamp Act riots in Rhode Island and the Regulator Rebellion in North Carolina tell a broader story about the evolution of American political thought in the decades surrounding the American Revolution, while exploring the local and transatlantic tensions that infused the two events and how the identities of the two colonies evolved in the coming decades. Abby Chandler is an associate professor of American history at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, having earned her Ph.D. from the University of Maine at Orono, excuse me if I butchered that, in 2008. Her research focuses on political movements in 18th-century British North America and protest in the long 18th century. She is the author of Law and Sexual Misconduct in New England, 1650 to 1750, Steering Towards England, and that was published in 2016, and has written several articles for publications such as Maine History, the North Carolina Historical Review, Early Modern Women, and the North Carolina Historical Review. And she additionally she currently serves on the 250th American Revolution Anniversary Commission in Massachusetts. But before I turn things over to Dr. Chandler, I must cover, as always, the usual housekeeping items for our friends joining us on Zoom this evening. Following tonight's authors talk, there will be a question and answer session, so please feel free to submit your questions at any point during the presentation by using the Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to incorporate them with our live audience questions. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted by using the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming to Anderson House for the first time, Dr. Abby Chandler.
Well, thank you to all of you for turning out again this beautiful January evening. How's that? All right. So I'm going to be talking about the research behind my recent book, Seized with the Temper of the Times. And before I do that, because I am a historian, I'm going to talk about where this book project started for me, because of course you need the back history of that. And for me, this book history, the history of this book actually goes back to 2005. And at that point in time, I was working on a PhD at the University of Maine. And as you may have gathered from the title of that, Law and Sexual Misconduct, that dissertation was on a completely different topic. And I had interned at the Newport Historical Society in Newport, Rhode Island one summer because I'd worked in the museum field and I wanted to maintain those connections to the museum field. And while I was there, they assigned me to do some research on this gentleman right here, Martin Howard. He was born in Newport, Rhode Island, somewhere around the year 1715. They did not know a whole lot about him. But the reason they wanted to know more about him is because the house he lived in the 1750s and 1760s is a house in their collection. And I'll show you some pictures of that house in a little bit. So this was my starting place. Martin Howard, born in Newport, Rhode Island around the year 1715. Also, he was a loyalist. And so I started reading about Howard. And as I was reading, I came across this passage. Our personal rights, comprehending those of life, liberty, and estate, are secured to us by the common law, which is every subject's birthright, whether born in Great Britain, on the ocean, or in the colonies. And is in this sense we are said to enjoy all the rights and privileges of Englishmen. This is what really made me think, I need to know more about this man. Because would we hear people in the 18th century quoting life, liberty, and estate, or life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, we, of course, think of John Locke, the originator of that expression, and we think of Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. But this is a man who was a loyalist, who was also borrowing from John Locke. And that was the thing that made me say, I need to know more about him. So in the course of that summer, I did some preliminary research, but this just kept on at the back of my mind. Who was this man, and what was behind the decisions that he made? And I eventually finished my PhD. I eventually wrote a first book on the topic of my dissertation, and it was 2015, so 10 years after that starting point for me. And I had tenure finally, and I had a sabbatical so I could finally start researching Martin Howard. And so that eventually is what got me to this book. And in his introduction, Andrew mentioned that I would be talking about the Stamp Act crisis, which we're pretty familiar with, and the Regulator Rebellion in North Carolina, which is an episode from before the Revolution we're not so familiar with. The reason why I wrote a book about the Stamp Act crisis and the Regulator Rebellion is because Martin Howard experienced both of them firsthand. So while the original plan was that I wanted to write a book about him, there's not enough documentation on Martin that left by Martin Howard, and the reasons for that will become clear. So instead, what I did was to write a book that looked at the political movements that he became involved in. But over the course of that research, I increasingly realized that this decade, the 1760s, which we tend not to think about, because usually when we think about the advance of the revolution, it's the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre and all of those events, less so than the 1760s. But I increasingly became convinced the 1760s were as seminal a decade in what will become the United States as the 1770s. So while the chronology I'm going to be following is Martin Howard's chronology, I'll also be talking about the broader research that I was doing. So we're going back to Newport, and this is the Wanton Lyman Hazard House, as it is known today, which is the house that is in the collection of the Newport Historical Society. Martin Howard married a woman named Anne Brenton Conklin in 1757. If you're at all familiar with Rhode Island history, the name Brenton might ring a bell. They're some of the early settlers of Rhode Island. And so he was marrying a woman who is connected to one of those older, very established families. And he is very much establishing himself as an up-and-coming citizen of Newport and Rhode Island as a whole. So they purchased this house in 1757. She sadly will pass away in 1764. He actually writes a letter to Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, of course, corresponds with everybody. So Martin Howard corresponding with him is not that much of a surprise. But again, one of the sort of clues I had to this man is he mentions her death in this letter and how much he's grieving. And if you're familiar with letters from the 18th century, people tend not to think about or talk about, they think about it. They tend not to think about personal things. So that again gave me a sense of who this man was, that he felt comfortable talking about how his grief at this particular point in time. So that's sort of the tragic thing that is going on in a time period in which his world is just expanding all over the place. He's an overseer of the poor. So one of the people who's responsible for making sure that people who are impoverished in Newport are getting support from the town. He moderates the Newport Town Council. He represents Newport in the Rhode Island General Assembly, which is the Rhode Island legislature. He also represents Rhode Island at the Albany Congress in 1754. And this is another of those moments in the pre-American Revolution that we don't know all that much about. The Albany Congress was a gathering of delegates from the various northern colonies who were meeting to discuss the possibility of a union among the northern colonies. And just to give you a sense of how well placed that house they purchased was, this picture is the Colony House in Newport, Rhode Island, which is where the legislature met. And if you look really, really, really carefully off to the side, you can just see Martin Howard's house tucked in the angle of Broadway Street. So he really has chosen to be right in the center of everything. And I think maybe the most important thing to know about all of these positions is these are all things he was elected to. So 1750s, early 1760s, he is very much a person who is liked and respected by his neighbors. He's active politically in the town, and it feels like this is going to be his future. Unfortunately, for Martin Howard, of course, the entire world changes. And the thing that is the starting point is the end of the 7 Years' War, the portion of it in North America we know as the French and Indian War, at the Treaty of Paris in 1763. And as I say to my students, the good news about Britain in 1763 is they're now an empire and they have this massive global empire. The bad news is they owe 150 million pounds, and that's their money, not ours, to European banks, and it has to be paid back. And they have some experiments with taxing people in Britain. That does not go well. There are demonstrations outside the prime minister's house. Eventually, there's a decision that they are going to start taxing the British colonists. Initially, they start with the Sugar Act in 1764. That doesn't really go anywhere. And then they pass the Duties in American Colonies Act, which we know better as the Stamp Act, on March 22nd, 1765. The way this worked is that colonists must pay in money for paper documents to be stamped. And in some cases, this stamp is like the one in the picture here. It's like getting a document notarized today. In others, it's a piece of paper that would paste on. And they are requiring this of all kinds of things. If you were publishing a newspaper, it would have to be on stamped paper. And again, this is the example I use in class, if you're graduating from college, your diploma has to be on stamped paper, because if it's not on stamped paper, it's meaningless. And of course, if you've done the work to get a college degree, you want that diploma to actually carry some weight. They also, as we know, taxed wallpaper. And this set of images is from the Parson Barnard House in North Andover, Massachusetts, my hometown. And some years ago, they took down the layers and layers and layers and layers of wallpaper. And so we have the 1750 layer of wallpaper. We have the 1765 layer of wallpaper. And when they were looking at that one layer, they also found one of the stamps. So there it is, preserved on the wall of the Parson Barnard House. And then the layers of wallpaper go on from there. So you have all of these documents that are now having to be stamped in order to officially exist in the colonies. And as all of you probably know, most of the British colonists are not happy about this. What I found as I was doing my research in the Stamp Act that I found fascinating is how your colony was politically organized coming into the Stamp Act crisis completely and totally informed how you and your colony would respond to the Stamp Act. And to give you some examples of this, in 1765, Rhode Island and Connecticut are the last two charter colonies. And this is a much older political system for organizing colonies. Originally, almost all the colonies were charter colonies. And this means that you have a charter, a document from the King of England, which says you can set up your colony, you can elect your governor, you can elect your legislature. And in 1765, as I said, Rhode Island and Connecticut are the only charter colonies left. By that point in time, all the other British North American colonies have been converted to royal colonies who can elect their legislatures, but their governors and chief justices are appointed by the British Crown. So in most of the British colonies, the Stamp Act crisis is setting up a battle between the royally appointed governors, who are pro-Stamp Act, because if they weren't pro-Stamp Act, they'd lose their jobs, and the locally elected legislature, who are anti-Stamp Act. But Rhode Island, as I mentioned, is a charter colony. The governor is locally elected, and the Rhode Island legislature is locally elected, and they're both opposed to the Stamp Act. So there shouldn't really have been any kind of problem in Rhode Island because everybody in the government is opposed to the Stamp Act. And we know that the Stamp Act crisis in Connecticut is extremely quiet because of the exact same thing. However, Rhode Island also has a group who are known as the Newport Junto. And here is where Martin Howard re-enters this story. The Newport Junto, and a junto is a name that was very popular at this period for a political organization in which people get together to talk about the politics of the day. And Benjamin Franklin very famously has one in Philadelphia. The Newport Junto, however, is one that is very, very, very pro-British Empire. Its members include Martin Howard, whom of course you know about, a man named Thomas Moffat, he is a doctor from Scotland, a man named Augustus Johnston, he will be the stamp tax master in Rhode Island, a man named Peter Harrison, he is actually probably the best known of the group today. He was an architect. He designed King's Chapel in Boston. He also designed the Redwood Library, Truro Synagogue, and the Brick Marketplace in Newport, Rhode Island. And finally, we have John Robinson and George Rome. John Robinson is a customs agent. George Rome is involved in shipping. And they organized in 1764 because they were advocating for Rhode Island to be a royal colony. Rhode Island at this particular point in time has extremely tense internal political problems. They elect a governor, and the candidate he defeated screams and yells and then manages to defeat that governor, but then the first governor defeats the second governor, and you get the general idea. Total chaos. And so they feel that if Rhode Island was a royal colony, then the governor would be appointed by the crown, and that this would calm down partisan politics in Rhode Island. They advocated for home textile production in Rhode Island. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but that is something I did a lot of research on, so I'm happy to answer more questions about that. And they, of course, will be advocating for the Stamp Act in 1765. And Martin Howard really is the man who represents this group. He's publishing letters to the editor in the Newport Mercury supporting the Stamp Act. And then he publishes his pamphlet. And that pamphlet is what I had quoted from originally. It has a really interesting title, A Letter from a Gentleman at Halifax to His Friend in Rhode Island. This is not because Martin Howard suddenly went off to Nova Scotia. What was going on with this title is that Halifax was the seat of the British Army and Navy in the 1760s. So if you say you are a gentleman at Halifax, this is code for this will be a pro-imperial pamphlet. So he publishes this in 1765, and it really starts to get into his explanation for why he feels it is the Stamp Act is all right, that this is not impinging on the rights of the colonies. And this is where that quote that I'd started with originally came from. In his mind, there are two types of rights granted to British subjects by Parliament. There's personal rights, the life, the liberty, and estate. You have that. And that does not matter where in the British Empire you are. But political rights, he believes, are something that is decided by Parliament. If Parliament had intended the colonies to have direct representation in Parliament, they would have done so. They didn't. Therefore, Parliament deciding to create the Sugar and the Stamp Acts is all right. Well, as you can imagine, this does not go over well with his neighbors. And all through the summer of 1765, things are just getting worse and worse and worse. And on August 14th, the first of the Boston Stamp Act riots takes place when Andrew Oliver, who's the stamp tax master for Massachusetts, is hanged in effigy. And an effigy is a bit like creating a scarecrow of someone. You stick a label on it saying, this is so-and-so. You then do bad things to the effigy as a way of protesting the decisions made by that person. So on August 19th, there's an account of the effigy being hanged on Newbury Street in Boston, and eventually Andrew Oliver's house is attacked. Martin Howard, of course, reads this. He's horrified. And he publishes a letter to the Newport Mercury, his local paper, on August 26th. And again, I found this an interesting window into his thought process of this period. The author of the Halifax letter cannot repress his astonishment at the mistaken notions of those who, under a pretense of serving the course of liberty, would take away the rights of private judgment and stop the avenues to truth by instigating the populace and endeavoring to point their fury against the person and intent of a man merely because he happens to differ in opinion from his countrymen. In short, we're British. We have freedom of speech. I am exercising my freedom of speech. You guys were exercising your freedom of speech when you protested against the Stamp Act. We both have the right to do this. You don't have the right to take away my right to free speech. Again, this does not go over well. And the following day, effigies of Martin Howard, Thomas Moffat, and Augustus Johnston. Howard and Moffat are the most active members of the Newport Junto. Augustus Johnston is the stamp tax master, are hanged on the Newport Parade. If you're familiar with Newport today, the Colony House is here. The brick marketplace, which you can see at the bottom end of that picture, is here. The space in between them today is called Washington Park, but in the 1760s, because of course George Washington was not a person who was particularly important to anybody in Newport in the 1760s, it was known as the Parade. So their effigies are hanged on August 27th. And then Martin and Annie Howard. I'm going to talk a little bit about Annie here. Annie is Martin Howard's 10-year-old daughter. And as you know, her mother, Martin Howard's wife, Anne Brenton Conklin Howard, had passed away the previous year. And none of her grandparents are still alive in 1765, which means Martin Howard is also the only person alive there to take care of a 10-year-old. One of the things we don't know, because nobody recorded this, is what did Annie think? And that's one of the things I want to know about. What did it, and I'll never know this, what did it feel like to be a 10-year-old getting rowed out into the harbor to take shelter on a British naval ship because there are people coming to attack your house? Again, I don't know. And so Martin and Annie Howard and Thomas Moffat take shelter on the HMS Signet in Newport Harbor. The Howard and Moffat houses are attacked later that night, and the attacks were brutal. There are accounts they broke down the door, they broke open the windows, they went in, they hacked up the walls, they threw chains up or over the roof, trying to throw the house down around the chimney. And the house survived because it was well built, but it was in shambles. And Martin and Annie and Thomas Moffat traveled to London, where Howard and Moffat will testify about the events of the Stamp Act crisis. So I mentioned that I'm curious about what's going through Annie's head. Again, I don't know. One of the things I find very interesting about Annie Howard is that years later, in 1787, she will marry a man named Andrew Spooner. He was Andrew Oliver, whom you might remember as the stamp tax master in Boston, who was hanged in effigy and his house was attacked, grandson. And Andrew Spooner is also Thomas Hutchison, who was the last royally appointed governor of Massachusetts, whose house would be attacked in another Stamp Act riot on August 26th in 1787. And Andrew Spooner was a very young child at the time of the Stamp Act riots. And I genuinely wonder if this was a bond between the two of them. And so the Howards have now traveled to London. And as I mentioned, Howard and Moffat will testify about the events of the Stamp Act crisis. The Stamp Act will, of course, be repealed March 18th, 1766. This is a very famous engraving that was created by the Patriots in honor of the repeal of the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is created in 1755. It is repealed in 1766. It's a very young law. So it shows members of Parliament burying the very young law in a baby-sized coffin. They are not being particularly subtle here about their imagery. So, hooray, stamp tax is repealed. Here's one other side note on the repeal of the Stamp Act. Henry Conway is the Secretary of State for the British government. He represents the British North American colonies. He'll send Samuel Ward, who's the governor of Rhode Island, a letter on March 31st, 1766, in which he notes that those unhappy people whom the outrage of the populace has driven from America, that's Howard and Moffat, which is that unprovoked by the injuries they suffered, they gave their testimonies with knowledge and without passion or prejudice. Those testimonies had, I believe, great weight in persuading the repeal of the Stamp Act. And that was another of my sort of glimpses of Martin Howard as a person. I mean, he had to flee for his life. He had to leave his home. But when he testified about that, he clearly advocated for the people who had attacked his home, because at that point in time, he was making the argument to Parliament, I supported the Stamp Act. I still think the Stamp Act was a good idea, but it's clear that many people did not. And I think you guys might need to think about that. And it looks as if that advocacy helped lead to the repeal. It also, I think, presented Martin Howard to Parliament and King George III as a man who could be trusted. He obviously supports the British Empire. He's willing to risk his life to support the British Empire, but he's also a diplomatic man. And in 1767, and now we're leaping into the second half of this book, he was made the Chief Justice for the colony of North Carolina, which is an enormous honor of that period. He marries a woman named Abigail Greenleaf on August 26, 1767. Her father was Stephen Greenleaf, who's the last royally appointed sheriff of Suffolk County. So here we have another loyalist connection. He has his portrait painted. This is that portrait I started with, by John Singleton Copley. By the way, I was told by a justice in Boston that this is our single best example of what the robes worn by a chief justice in the British North American colonies looked like. And so people who are interested in the judicial history of the British colonies in the United States look on this painting as a window onto that particular world. So he has this portrait painted by Copley. And the Howard family moves to North Carolina. So the Howard family are moving to North Carolina, which is in some ways a very different place than Rhode Island, and in others, and this is one of the things that I noticed in the course of my research, is very similar to Rhode Island. One of the things that I think we're all familiar with now is Rhode Island's commitment to religious toleration. Very famously, there's the Truro Synagogue, which George Washington will visit in the 1790s and write a letter about his commitment to religious freedom. What's a lesser known element in our collective knowledge of American colonial history is that North Carolina also has a long history of religious toleration. North Carolina and South Carolina originally were the same colony, Carolina colony. Their charter was written by John Locke. So John Locke's here again. And that charter explicitly laid out that this colony would not be impeding on people's right to practice their own religions. And if you had 7 people, you could declare yourself a church. So the Howards are entering a place with as long a history of religious toleration as the place they were coming from. And so that's an element of commonality. I think another thing that makes Rhode Island and North Carolina similar is they're both colonies that were second generation colonies. Massachusetts has founded a lot of the early Rhode Island colonists, of course, Roger Williams and Hutchison, are coming overland from Massachusetts. North Carolina, a lot of the early colonists are coming overland from Virginia and South Carolina. So these are colonies with a long history of religious toleration, but also a long history of people who are coming to these places because they didn't like where they started from. It's also a colony that is struggling a bit in the 1760s. They have a new governor, William Tryon. He has just built himself a new governor's mansion, which is known as Tryon's Palace. I'll talk more about that in a bit. So the Howards are here. They are settling in Newbern, North Carolina. This is the house that they lived in that period. It is still standing. And we have this letter written by a man named John Whiting. John Whiting is a Newport resident. His daughter, Mary, had married a young man from North Carolina who attended Yale University, studied with Ezra Stiles, who's the congregational minister in Newport, Rhode Island. So Mary Whiting has married this young man from North Carolina. The two of them move back to North Carolina. Her father comes to visit them, and they have Martin Howard over for tea as another Newport neighbor. And so we have this letter, and perhaps the Sons of Liberty may claim some acknowledgement for his present honorary and lucrative situation with which they have regaled him. And I get the sense that Martin Howard is rather enjoying the living well is the best form of revenge stage of his life. So he is now the Chief Justice. This requires a huge amount of travel because he and the 2 associate justices are traveling from court to court to court. So we've got some evidence of that. This is the court records from the Salisbury County Court. You can see the Honorable Martin Howard Esquire in the center. This is the Chowan County Courthouse in Edenton, North Carolina, which is the last surviving courthouse from 18th century North Carolina. And we know that he also superintended the court there. Now, I alluded to the fact there are also some problems in North Carolina. Those problems are the Regulator Rebellion. And the regulators are all coming from Orange County. Today, this is central North Carolina. 1760s, this is the edge, the western edge of North Carolina. And Orange County today looks very much as it did back in the 18th century. So why are people calling themselves regulators? Why are they rebelling? Well, North Carolina, as I mentioned, is a very poor colony. The royal governor, Tryon, the chief justice, Martin Howard, and members of the legislature are all salaried positions. However, county positions, the sheriffs and clerks, do not have salaries, but they are allowed to collect a percentage of the taxes and fees they collect. And there are zero regulations on those percentages of the collection process. So you had to pay taxes to help pay off the debt from building Tryon's palace, as an example. The sheriff would come to your farm and say, "Hi, I'm here to collect the taxes for Tryon's palace, or the colony taxes, or the imperial taxes, whatever form." And the sheriff was then allowed to collect a additional percentage, and he got to name the percentage. Was he going to be generous to the farmer and only collect 1%? Or was he going to go away out on a limb and collect 10%? Zero regulations. Also, there was nothing that required the sheriff to write it down, so he could come back next week and say, "You didn't pay your taxes." And you could say, "Yes, I did." And you could say, "No, you didn't." And you get the general idea. And what with one thing or another, the regulators are deeply frustrated by this. I also mentioned that long history of religious toleration in North Carolina. The regulators are largely Baptists, Methodists, Quakers, the more radical of the Protestant religions. Tryon is trying to make North Carolina be an entirely Anglican colony. They're not happy about that. So you have all of this, and the regulators take a number of actions. They write petitions, they write pamphlets, but they also start taking some more violent action as they're getting more and more frustrated. In September of 1770, a group of regulators disrupted the Superior Court meeting in Hillsborough, that's the county seat for Orange County, and they attacked a man named Edmund Fanning, who is the Orange County clerk of that period. So if you wanted to sell a piece of land, he would process the sale. He could then collect a percentage of the fees for processing his land. So they break up this court session, attack Edmund Fanning, and there's concern about holding the next court session. There's going to be one in March of 1771 in Salisbury. Here's the story gets really interesting. And here's an excerpt from a letter. So, Governor Tryon, in consultation with Martin Howard and the two associate justices, decide we're just going to cancel the court session. It's too dangerous. But there's a couple of North Carolina farmers who go and interview some regulators who live in Salisbury. And they note there would have been no danger for Chief Justice Howard to have held a court, but as to the associate justices, they were silent. And this is a theme that runs through the Regulator Rebellion. They liked Martin Howard, and it feels like Martin Howard from up north, who is the Chief Justice appointed by the king, would be the last man in the world that the regulators would like. But A, he appears to have treated them fairly. B, and here's where we get into the real heart of the Regulator Rebellion. They ultimately are frustrated with the lack of regulation on the collecting of fees in North Carolina. And they're submitting all these petitions to the legislature saying, this is a problem, this is corrupt, you're extorting us. The legislature doesn't want to fix it. The reason why the legislature doesn't want to fix it is the members of the legislature are all wealthy Eastern-based families in North Carolina. The county clerks and the sheriffs are their younger sons and their nephews and their cousins. So the corrupt North Carolina laws are benefiting all these families. And this is why the regulators are rebelling. But Martin Howard is an outsider. He has no reason to support the legislature. He has no reason to not take the regulator's side. And both of those associate justices are men from North Carolina. And this is starting to set up this paradigm that I found fascinating, which is the regulators, like Martin Howard. Martin Howard is a man who, as all of you know, is deeply hated by people who will become patriots. So the fault lines of where people are lining up on the positions they're taking in this lead up to the American Revolution are starting to take hold, and they're starting to take hold in ways that at first glance make no sense. So things go badly for the regulators. There's finally a battle at the Battle of Alamance in May of 1771, and they are violently crushed. This is a picture of the Regulator Memorial in Hillsborough, North Carolina. But that pattern had been set in place. They, like Martin Howard, the Chief Justice appointed by the Crown. William Tryon will go in the spring of 1771 to be the governor of New York, very famously. He's replaced by a man named Josiah Martin. And one of the things that Josiah Martin was instructed to do by George III was figure out what's going on with those regulators, because colonists rebelling is something George III is worried about in 1771, as is Parliament. So Josiah Martin goes out to the backcountry on this tour, basically sitting down and interviewing regulators. Why did you rebel? What's the problem? And the regulators say, well, the North Carolina colonial government is corrupt. And Josiah Martin says, you know what? It is. He goes back to the legislature and says, you guys are corrupt. Well, by this point in time, it's 1772, when we're well on the way to the revolution, and the North Carolina legislature basically looks at Josiah Martin and says, you're telling us how to run our colony. This is imperial overreach. They will kick him out in May of 1775. North Carolina is the first colony to overthrow the royal government, which is something I have to remind people of in Massachusetts periodically. So Martin is out. Howard family, they are allowed to remain on their plantation outside New Bern for a couple of years. And here again, Martin Howard is deeply liked and respected by the regulators, but he also had friends among the Patriot government. And this is the reason why when Josiah Martin is kicked out, Martin Howard and Abigail Greenleaf Howard and Annie Howard are allowed to stay for another couple years at their plantation. And it is on the Neuse River in North Carolina. And one of the archivists at the North Carolina State Archives helped me figure out where it was. And it's just this breathtaking, it hasn't been developed, lovely place. And I'm going to finish with one other of the passages of Martin Howard's that really caught my eye all those years ago in 2005. So the real reason they're allowed to stay in North Carolina for another couple of years is Martin Howard had become friends with a man named James R. Adele. Some of you might have heard of him. He will be one of the first justices of the first Supreme Court of the United States. So he is very much a patriot. His wife is the sister of the first governor of the state of North Carolina, but Martin Howard has forged this friendship with the two of them, so across these political lines. And as I mentioned, they're allowed to stay New Bern in 1775, but in 1777, the Revolutionary War will catch up with the Howard family again. All loyalists were required to leave North Carolina in 1777. The Howards will then move to London. But just before they leave North Carolina for good, Howard sends this letter. You might be able to add one to the few observations which may be made upon an unimportant character, viz., I'd made 2 blades of grass grow where only one grew before. I'm a gardener. This just spoke to me. A circumstance among some nations of no small honor and renown. So, in writing this book, I have this story of this one underknown man who I think has a lot to tell us about the period leading into the American Revolution. He is deeply committed to his beliefs to the point that he's willing to flee for his life twice. But you also see over the course of his time in North Carolina a commitment to really trying to work on getting along with both sides of that political conundrum that the revolution is increasingly posing. I forgot to mention this before. A lot of the regulators will go on to be loyalists. So we really have these fault lines taking hold. So he's really trying to cross over that political divide while also recognizing the United States is not a country he wants to be a part of. He will eventually die in exile in London. So in writing this book, I have the story of Martin Howard and the larger Howard family. I'm eventually going to write a book about Abigail Greenleaf, who's also a fascinating woman in her own right. But I think we also have a window onto a period of American history in which people are feuding with each other. People are starting to make decisions that are going to shape the rest of their lives, but also trying to figure out, okay, how do you create a functioning society? What do you need to have in a functioning society? And that, I think, is ultimately what we can learn from these rebellions of the 1760s and 1770s. How these men get to their respective positions is often very different, but ultimately they have the same goal to create a nation that is worth having, even if this does mean that half of them wind up having to leave. So thank you all very much for coming out tonight.
I have a question about something that's on the cover page of your book, Rebellions. And I'm wondering if you could bring that up. I get the exact phraseology, but
Almost there. There we go.
Identity and rebellion in pre-revolutionary America. And I'm wondering what your view is. Was this a period of rebellion and then that it ended, or has rebellion in one way or another kind of been part of America ever since the 1760s or before?
For better or worse, I would
better or for worse, yeah.
I would say yes. So the Regulator Rebellion is, of course, a pre-Revolutionary War rebellion. But if you look at Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, the Whiskey Rebellion and the Freest Rebellion in Pennsylvania, you can definitely see some threads. And actually, Herman Husband, who's one of the core leaders of the Regulators, is going to wind up being a core leader of the Whiskey Rebellion. So that's a direct connection. This is something I've grappled a lot with in the writing of this book. And part of why I started with my own history is I first became interested in Martin Howard in 2005. I really seriously started my research in 2015. The bulk of this book was written 2016, 2017, 2018, talk about years to be thinking about rebellion in the United States. And in the long run, I have come to be very grateful I did not write this book in the early 2000s, because that I don't think was the moment to write it. And the reason I didn't was I was already working on a dissertation on a completely different topic. And I think I knew at the time this was a book that was bigger than a dissertation. Yeah, for better or worse. The thing that strikes me about the regulators, and for that matter, the Shazites, the goal is not to blow everything up. The goal is to make the place they're living in a better place. And I am okay with rebellion, which the goal is to make things better. I question rebellion for the purpose of blowing things up. And I will leave it there.
What accounted for Howard's appointment as Chief Justice in North Carolina, a long way from Rhode Island, and of course, just shortly after he returned from London, as you tell it?
So, a couple of things. This is a metaphor I use in the book. The positions of royal governors and chief justices are a bit like looking at a chessboard. You have the set number of chess pieces to begin with. Gradually over time, pieces are getting knocked off the board. Now, in a game of chess, you don't bring new people in, but that's very much how those positions work. You have somebody in place, and William Tryon is an excellent example of this. He's a lower level person who has the good fortune to marry a woman whose brother-in-law is Lord Hillsborough, who is one of the core players in managing the British North American colonies. So Lord Hillsborough appoints Tryon to that position because of Tryon's connections. And so once you get on the board, then you keep moving your way up. North Carolina needed a chief justice in 1767 because their prior chief justice had just passed away. And as I alluded to earlier, this happens just after Martin Howard has testified before Parliament about the Stamp Act crisis without passion or prejudice. He was an attorney. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that. So he's got legal experience. They want to say thank you to him. I mean, he stood up for the empire. He was willing to risk his life to stand up for the empire. And he's a level-headed man. And so consequently, decision is made to gamble on him, basically. And did any of you in the 1990s watch the BBC television series, The Aristocrats, about the Lennox sisters? Emily, Caroline, Sarah, they have dramatically scandalous, but also fascinating lives. They marry into the great houses of Ireland. Caroline marries, blanking on his first name, last name is Fox, early major Whig player. Their brother, Lord Lennox, is the man, or last name is Lennox. He's Lord Richmond, sorry. He's the one who nominates Martin Howard to be the Chief Justice of North Carolina. Martin Howard, that plantation on the Neuse River is called Richmond, and he was nominated by Lord Richmond. So I'm pretty certain that was an acknowledgement to this is how he got that job. He was in the right place at the right time, and he had the right skills. It's a very roundabout way of coming about that. But that is basically how those jobs work. It's all a game of patronage.
Thank you for your research. It's really extraordinary. Could you speak a little bit about the stamps? How were the stamps applied? Were these imported items or sold items?
Yeah. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are a couple different types. There's the ones that get embossed, like getting a document notarized today, and you could see one there. So in that case, you would take your document, a letter would have to be on stamped paper. So in that case, you would take your document to the stamp tax master, you'd pay him the fee, he would press it in, and off you would go. Or there's the ones like this one where they're getting pasted on. They also pre-printed stamped paper. So at this point in time, making paper in the colonies is extremely difficult because the paper they're producing is small bits and pieces. The larger sheets of paper that you need to print a newspaper come over from Britain. And this actually becomes a huge issue with the Stamp Act crisis because just before the Stamp Act is about to take effect, there are all these ships coming over with the sheets of paper for all the colonial newspapers, and they're pre-stamped, but the various colonists who are objecting to the Stamp Act are refusing to let them unload the paper. So it varies. And that was one of the things I found interesting. Some of them are embossed. Some of them look like that. Some of them is a piece of paper where it was originally printed as part of the paper. It just varied on how it was going to be used. And of course, it never really took effect. So that's another complication.
After he returned to Britain, what became of him and his family?
So he does not live that much longer. He passes away in 1781 and leaves Abigail and Annie Howard. In 1783, when the war is over, Abigail brings Annie, who by that point in time is in her late 20s, early 30s, back to New England. I mentioned that Abigail Greenleaf's father was Stephen Greenleaf, the last royally appointed sheriff. And Stephen Greenleaf is interesting. He's a loyalist, but he has a brother who's a patriot. And they basically negotiate a deal. If Stephen and Mary Greenleaf will enter house arrest at their house in Boston, hand the job of the Suffolk County sheriff over to his brother, who's a patriot, and the two of them basically keep their mouths shut, they are allowed to stay in Boston. So yeah, through the duration of the war, there they are. So what this means for the purposes of my research is that Abigail has a home to go to once the war is over. She brings Annie with her. I mentioned I'm going to write a book about Abigail. She lives with her parents for another couple of years. In 1795, her parents have both passed away. She buys her own house in a brand new housing development. I know it sounds crazy to say housing development in the 1790s, but that's exactly what it was. It was designed by Charles Bulfinch. It was on Franklin Street in Boston, and it was intended to be this perfect urban lifestyle where you have access to culture. And the centerpiece of the Tontine Crescent was the Boston Library Society. And it was in the center, which is a library that Abigail helps found. And so that's the book I'm eventually going to write, is Abigail's years in Boston. I've mentioned the great frustration of Martin Howard is I have almost no documents from his perspective, because if you have to flee for your life twice, you don't leave much. So it is a great pleasure that the final years of Abigail's life, she'll eventually pass away in the early 1800s. She's in Boston. I live just north of Boston. And all of that, her life there is documented. So someday I'm going to be looking into that in her library, and I am greatly looking forward to learning more about her. They're an interesting family.
All right, Dr. Chandler, we do have some questions on Zoom. If you wouldn't mind going back to the stamp that you had
Of course.
previously. One viewer would like to know what all the Latin says. If you could translate that.
I can't do that,
Okay,
I'm
very
afraid.
good. All right.
I
He was just curious.
I have a dear friend who is a classics professor in my department at UMass Lowell. I will get Jane to translate and I will email that to you, Andrew.
Very good. And I know who asked the question. So
Yes.
very good.
We will get that figured out.
Appreciate that. One viewer would like to know what Martin's view on slavery was. Rhode Island, obviously leaning more towards anti-slavery, North Carolina the other way, and then the Crown sort of leaning more towards anti. What was his?
Okay, I'm gonna have to back up a little more.
Okay.
Rhode Island is very pro-slavery in the 1700s.
All right.
Rhode Island is the epicenter of the slave trade in the mainland British North American colonies because Newport is where something like 80% of the enslaved people who will wind up in the mainland colonies enter Newport. And that's because Rhode Island, which is a very small colony, looks to the ocean to earn a living. So a lot of men in Rhode Island become sea captains who are involved in the slave trade. And Howard on slavery is a case where I have bits and pieces of information and I'm not quite sure how to put them together. So one piece of information I have, Anne Brenton Conklin Howard, his first wife, marrying Martin Howard was her second marriage. Her first husband, John Conklin, was a wealthy merchant. When he passes away in the early 1750s, he leaves her 3 slaves. Now, did they come to the house, the Wanton Lyman Hazard House on Broadway Street in Newport when she married Martin Howard and they bought that house? I don't know, but it seems extremely likely. And in the early 2000s, they were doing some restoration work at that house. They took up the attic floorboards and they found a collection of artifacts, which most of which came from Africa, which some of them are on display at the Newport Historical Society. Some of them are normally on display at the National Museum of African American History. Much to my frustration, they're currently out on loan at someone else because I wanted to see the other half of them when I was there earlier today. So Howard almost certainly is a slave owner, and he owns a plantation in North Carolina, so probably. But he also issues a verdict saying, if you kill an African-American slave, you've committed murder and you need to be tried on murder charges. And I am the Chief Justice of North Carolina, and that's how we're doing it. And in the course of that document, he calls out the patriots for being hypocrites. How can you say you want freedom when you're also slaves owners? And as I said, I've got all these bits and pieces of information and I'm not quite sure what to do with them. The sense I have is slave owner at some point in his life, but I get the sense he is moving in the direction of the abolition movement. And we also know that many, many, many enslaved people joined the British Army because the British government had offered them freedom. So that is a trajectory that makes a certain amount of sense. So I don't know. It's the end of the question. But that's the information I'm working with as I try to decide that.
Great. Thank you. And one last question. Some people were interested in learning more about Alamance. Can you give a very brief overview of that, please?
Okay, so Regulator Rebellion, early stages, you have regulators, as I mentioned, writing petitions, writing pamphlets, and starting to stage violent attacks on courthouses and court sessions. And things start seriously falling apart. And William Tryon makes the decision late in 1770, early in 1771, that he needs to put a stop to this. And this is a decision that the North Carolina legislature are very in favor of. They don't want to change their ways. They don't want to fix things. They are very opposed to the regulators. In January of 1771, North Carolina passes a law called Johnson's Riot Act, which says if you have 10 or more men who look like they're going to commit violence and a sheriff tells them to stand down and they don't, well, then you can arrest them on the spot. It has this really interesting clause in which can be retroactively applied. And Tryon is getting ready to put regulators on trial. And he decides that those court trials are going to be held in Hillsborough because it would be challenging to move all of the regulators from Orange County out to New Bern, which is the capital of North Carolina at this period, for trial. So Tryon calls up the North Carolina militia. They head to Alamance. Initially, the plan was arrest the regulators, put them on trial. The regulators gather together whatever guns they can. They all meet up on the battlefield, and the regulators just can't sustain it. There's this one moment where they capture a cannon, but they only capture the cannon. In order for a cannon to be useful, you have to have cannonballs. They don't have any cannonballs. So great, we've got the cannon. So they're not firing cannonballs at us, but we can't do anything with it. Just to give you a sense of how outnumbered they are. So they get violently crushed. And after that, 12 of them will be put on trial on treason charges, and 6 of them will be hanged. And this memorial marks where that happened. So that is what happened at the Battle of Alamance.
Very good. Thank you very much. And I think we'll just wrap up there. So I want to thank you again for coming down here, making the trip
Thank
down
you for
on a
having
beautiful
me.
day to join us. Thank you all for making it out, braving the weather, and in person, and making it out on Zoom as well from afar. So we thank you all for your support of our mission, and we will see you again next time. So thank you very much. Get home safe.